All right, so here is looking at this unemployment rate, and we go up to the current period. All of this data comes from something called FRED, and I'll put a link to show you how to go to it. It's an easy way to get access to the current data, and it's presented in a very user-friendly kind of format. So anyways, here's some of the previous recessions, just so you have a comparison. So that's the right after the 9/11. And remember, unemployment tends to have this pattern of it actually peaks after the recession is over. It kind of peaks as the recession's getting over, people start coming back into the labor force, and they come back faster than the jobs are being created, and so the unemployment tends to rise a little bit more. And here's the financial crisis peak. It hit about 10%, and the first thing that's unusual about it is super high. So it hit almost 15% at the peak. The second thing that's super unusual is that it went up super fast, and it's coming down super fast. And those are both because of the unusual nature of this recession, right? So it hit about 15%, and now it looks like, based on this, it's about somewhere between 8 and 9% now. Okay, so those are both super unusual, and it's the nature of what's causing the recession. So it's not an economic cause, really. The main cause is about the COVID pandemic and the measures that people are taking to avoid the COVID pandemic. And there's kind of two parts to it. So there's the shutdowns, but there's also just the behavior people would be doing anyways. So they actually found even before the shutdown started, this unemployment rate started going up. So I don't have it written down like that, but by March, the unemployment rate was already on the way up, even though the data for March was collected before most states were shut down. So anyways, we get this unemployment rate has gone really high. It is falling quite a bit, but it remains to be seen if this will start to become flat like some of these previous ones, or if it will just continue to go straight back down. Okay. I would be surprised if it goes straight back down unless there's some kind of dramatic change in the economic situation. So I would expect it to kind of go like this. That's my expectation, but I don't know for sure. Okay, so anyways, this is the situation with the unemployment rate, and this is the same unemployment rate we learned about from this unit. Okay, next I'm going to go to labor force participation rate. So labor force participation rate, remember we said that it's falling, especially for men. Over time it has been falling. For women it was going up, although there was some kind of stagnation. And so since about 2000, the fall for men has sort of been, and women actually have been falling a little bit as well since about 2000. Before that time, women were increasing significantly. So when you put the two of them together, it started to fall. And it fell a little bit after the 2000 recession, and then it fell a lot after the financial crisis. And as the economy has gotten really good, and the unemployment rate finally got low, because remember it kind of takes a long time to recover. It's slowly recovering over all this time. It kind of stabilized here. Labor force participation, it kind of stabilized, and then it took a huge dive. Okay, so this is the second thing. So this second unusual thing about this COVID pandemic effect on the economy. The labor force participation does tend to drop during recessions, because some people can't find jobs and they get discouraged, and then they just leave the labor force, sometimes temporarily and sometimes long term. Okay, so that tends to happen, but it happened in a much more dramatic way. So we're going from about 63 point something percent down to almost 60%. Okay, so we get a pretty big drop in the labor force during this time period, right? And then since then that has started to recover, but it still has, and let me erase some of this, but it still has not recovered completely. Okay, so actually the unemployment number we see has a little bit of this hiding in it. So actually, if the people here had not left the labor force and had stayed in looking for jobs, the unemployment rate would have been quite a bit higher. Okay, so the unemployment rate getting almost to 15, it actually would have gotten significantly higher if we had included these people who left the labor force because either they didn't want to look for a job at that point because of the pandemic, or because they just didn't think they could find a job, so they left the labor force. And even now, the labor force has not completely recovered. So this number of somewhere between 8 and 9% that we were looking on the chart is also would be a little bit higher in that case. Okay, so it's always important to remember to look at the unemployment rate and also take a look at the labor force participation rate at the same time. Okay, so continuing on, and now we're going to look at a little bit of demographics real quick. So remember we said that before the 1980s, there was this pattern where women tended to have higher unemployment rates than men, especially during recessions. And then at some point, this pattern reversed itself. Okay, so it became the other way around at some point. Well, so where men tended to have higher unemployment rate during recessions, and during good times, they were roughly the same. Okay, but this one has been different. So in this recession, actually, the unemployment rate for women was quite a bit higher than for men. I think it's so some of this is so new that there really haven't even been detailed studies yet, or they're still in process. So some of this I'm just kind of basing on my knowledge, but not necessarily on having read detailed research about this. But I think my hunch is that it's based on the structure of this recession. So many of the things that got shut down were things in the service industry, and the type of things that got shut down likely employed more women than men. Okay, so whereas in the recent recessions, it had been things like manufacturing and transportation that were getting shut down, and these areas employed more men. Also, the financial sector, not shut down, but were going out of business or slowing down. And whereas in this one, the types of things that got shut down were probably normally more stable during recessions. So that's why it kind of reversed this pattern. I would still suspect in the future recessions, it will go back to be this pattern. Okay, I think it's just because of the unusual nature of this particular recession. All right, going forward, one more thing. The last thing is, remember we said that there was that unemployment rates were higher for Hispanic and for Black workers. The unemployment rates have always been quite a bit higher. And so remember, again, for unemployment, always keep in mind, this is people who are actively looking for jobs but haven't found one yet. Okay, so that the unemployment rate has been quite a bit higher. In fact, at times was way, way, way higher for African American workers. And we can see during the recovery, they tend to get closer together. Okay, so at the peak of this, they're really far apart. For African Americans, it was almost 17%, and for white workers, we're talking 10% was the peak. And then as we come down here, they're getting closer together. Okay, that tends to be the pattern. The bottom line is for Asian Americans, and that tends to be very similar for Asian workers, tends to be very similar to white workers in most cases. Now we see this was also unusual in that the spike hit everybody. Now still African American workers were hit badly, but actually Hispanic workers were hit even worse. And this is unusual. So if you remember back to the data we looked at before, typically the African Americans have the highest unemployment in all time periods, and they tend to be hit the worst during recessions. Okay, and so but in this particular recession, the recession hit everybody quite a lot. Okay, so it wasn't as concentrated to certain groups as it sometimes is. Okay, it was more spread with everybody, but it hit Hispanics especially hard, and it hit everybody really hard. But we do see there seems to be some difference on the recovery. So the unemployment rate has normalized quite a bit for white workers, and it's still quite high for both Hispanic and African American workers. So we see some of this old pattern still emerging here. So anyways, this is just to give you an update of what's going on. We'll talk more about this going forward. So it's not time yet, but in the future classes, we can then talk about, well, what can we do about this? Okay, so once we get there, so let's be patient, but I wanted to get you the data so you can see where we're at right now.